I never spent my last $12 without knowing exactly what I was buying. That morning in Pikeville, I knew. The man behind the counter hoped I did not. His name was Jasper Tull, and he had been the county assessor in Bledsoe County for longer than most of the roads had their proper names. He was a careful man, the kind who filled in ledger columns with a precision that suggested he feared the universe itself might come undone if a figure went in the wrong row. He had ink, the permanent color of storm clouds, worked so deep into the creases of his fingers that I suspected soap had long since surrendered to it. He looked at me the way careful men look at women who come in alone and ask questions without apologizing for them, a look that contained both pity and the quiet wish that I would simply move along. I was 62 years old. I had delivered more than 400 children into this world, set broken limbs in farmhouses where the nearest doctor was a full day's ride in good weather, and kept more people alive through hard winters with dried herbs and poultices than I could count on both hands 3 times over. I had buried my husband George 6 months before that morning, and I had watched the farm I had tended for 31 years go at auction to pay the debts he had never told me about while he was living to tell them. I walked into Jasper Tull's office with $12 folded into the pocket of my good coat and a piece of knowledge I had carried since I was 22 years old. I walked in knowing exactly what I intended to do with both. Tull ran his finger down columns of figures with the practiced solemnity of a man conducting a ritual he believed in less than he once had, until it stopped on a line he seemed almost ashamed to read aloud. He told me there was a lot at the eastern edge of Grassy Cove. 3 acres assessed at $9 untouched by any willing buyer for 5 full years. He set the ledger flat before saying the rest. And the rest was the part that cleared the room of its comfortable air, so to speak. It was the Blue Spring lot, he told me, and his voice dropped the way voices drop when a man speaks of something he has decided is beyond reasoning with. He described the spring the way people describe a thing they have made up their minds about long before they ever looked at it closely. The water ran blue, he said. Not the blue of sky on water, not the blue of deep river in summer, but wrong blue, mineral blue, the blue that meant copper or sulfur or something. The mountain had kept buried for a reason no living man had bothered to determine. A previous owner's cattle had refused to drink from it. Nothing cultivated would grow near it. 3 separate families had held the deed over the years, and each one had walked away without driving a single nail. He looked at me with the patient weariness of a man who has given the same warning until it has gone smooth in his mouth like a river stone worn past its edges. You do not want that land, Mrs. Birch. I asked him why a spring of water on a piece of ground was a curse instead of a blessing, since water was the one thing that made any land worth owning at all. He told me that good water and bad water were 2 different animals entirely, and that blue water was the kind a sensible person walked away from before she had a chance to regret her curiosity. I laid my $12 on the counter. He stared at the bills longer than he needed to, as though he still believed I might snatch them back and come to my senses before anyone had to witness the transaction. I did not. He sighed, reached for the deed papers, and that sigh was the first of many small, involuntary sounds I would collect over the years, the noises people make when a woman past 60 refuses to be saved from herself. Let me tell you who I was before I tell you what I found at the bottom of that bluff. I was born Wanda Gill in the spring of 1819, in a farmhouse set into the western slope of the Cumberland Plateau, the 4th child and 2nd daughter of a tobacco farmer who understood soil the way some men understand horses by instinct, before explanation, and never entirely by language. He could look at a field and tell you what it needed, the way a doctor looks at a face and tells you where the fever lives. My mother kept a kitchen garden that fed 9 people through every hard winter I can remember, and she understood plants with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in genuine conversation with them. listening as much as directing. She taught me to read a wilting leaf the way a doctor reads a labored breath. She taught me that the color of soil crumbled between the fingers told a story worth listening to, and that a good gardener learned to be still and receive before she ever made a mark on the ground. When I was 18, I married George Birch and we moved to his family's land in Mason County. And I spent the next 4 decades doing the work that women do in country places, which is more than most histories ever bother to write down and remember. I delivered babies in cold rooms and hot ones in farmhouses and cabins, and once in a barn when there was no choice, and the choice turned out well. I set bones and drew out infections, and kept larders stocked with the tinctures and dried preparations that meant the difference in a winter between the family that came through and the one that did not. I kept a garden that people drove considerable miles to see. Not for the beauty of it, though, beauty was present, but because what I grew tasted different from what other gardens grew. More of itself, a neighbor woman told me once, searching for language that did not quite exist for the things she meant. Like the tomato remembered what a tomato was supposed to be before someone decided convenience mattered more than truth. George was a good man in the ways that count between people who share a life, and a careless man in the ways that ruin a family's standing. He died of a fever in October of 1880 and left behind a debt I did not know existed, wound through the farm's title in a way that left me no room to move in any direction but out. The auction was held in December. I stood at the edge of our yard and watched strangers carry off 31 years of my life in portions they haggled over before they lifted, and I felt the cold that comes not from weather but from a particular kind of understanding. The cold of knowing that what you have built your whole existence inside can be legally separated from you between one season and the next. I moved into town. I took a room at the widow Hartley's boarding house, a kind woman who did not ask more questions than a situation required, and who heated the hallway adequately, if not generously. I spent that winter going through what remained of George's papers, sorting the recoverable from the irretrievable in the methodical way of someone who has decided that order is the one thing grief cannot remove if you apply yourself to maintaining it. It was in that pile wedged between a promissory note for lumber he had never settled and a receipt for harness fittings from a shop that had closed years before that I found a hand-drawn map with a notation in handwriting that was not George's. Blue Spring Lot, Grassy Cove, 3 acres. The notation had been made by someone who had offered to sell it to George some years earlier, and beneath the offer, in George's own deliberate script, was a single word: cursed. I held that paper a long time in the cold of my borrowed room in the thin afternoon light that came through the one window, in the particular silence of a woman alone with a decision she has already made, but has not yet said aloud to herself. I thought of Ida Brandt. Ida had been my neighbor for the first 8 years of my marriage. An old woman even then, a German immigrant who had come to Tennessee as a young bride with seeds in her trunk and knowledge in her head, and who kept a garden that put mine to shame in those early years before I had learned enough to be a fair competition. She was the first person outside my own mother who taught me that soil is not a surface, but a world that beneath every garden was a civilization of creatures too small for any eye to find, and all of them laboring in the dark to turn dead things back into the substance that fed living ones. She had told me once, in the particular way old women tell the things they most want carried forward, about the springs in the country she had come from. Healing springs, she called them. Some ran blue, some ran the color of rust. People had been drinking from them and pouring them over their kitchen gardens for longer than anyone in those places could count the years, longer than the towns had their names or their churches. An old traveling apothecary had told her grandmother that the color in such springs came from what the stone gave the water on its long passage through the dark, and that what the stone gave was not poison, but the opposite of it. the very substance the earth had been distilling in the dark for time beyond any human accounting. What the stone keeps in the dark, the root receives as light. Ida had said it once, simply the way true things are said, and then gone back to thinning her beet seedlings without further elaboration. And I had kept it the way you keep a thing that does not make full sense to you in the moment, but that you know with a certainty you cannot entirely justify that you will need someday. It sat in me for 40 years, patient as the limestone it described. When I held George's map in that cold boarding house room and read the word cursed in his careful hand, I felt that patience come to its end. I folded the map and put it in my coat pocket and went to sleep that night with the settled certainty of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning to read the evidence before her and has finally found what she has been looking for in the last place anyone would think to show it to her. The walk from Pikeville to the eastern edge of Grassy Cove was 4 miles on a road that began as packed dirt and became something closer to a suggestion by the time it reached the back of the valley. Grassy Cove itself is a peculiar geography, a great bowl pressed into the plateau by forces older than the county that named it, ringed on every side by ridges that hold it apart from the surrounding country in a way that makes the place feel deliberate, as though someone made the decision long ago that this valley should be its own world and arranged the stone accordingly. The creek at the cove's low end does not run to any river you can follow on a published map. It simply disappears into the limestone, swallowed without ceremony the way the cove absorbs everything eventually. It was the second week of April 1881. The redbuds were finishing along the ridgeline, that particular purple pink that exists exactly long enough to make you believe the spring will be generous before the summer heat arrives to instruct you otherwise. I walked with my canvas bag over one shoulder and George's map in my coat pocket, and the $12 already spent in my thinking spent on the only thing remaining in my life that I both needed and could afford. My 3 acres lay at the eastern lip of the cove, where the flat valley floor ran up against a wall of pale limestone. The ground was mostly level, which was a mercy I had not expected when Jasper Tull described it. The soil was thin and stony, freckled with scrub grass, and the occasional cedar tree bent permanently sideways by the wind off the ridge, growing in the enduring attitude of something that has been losing a slow argument for decades and has made its peace with continuing to grow anyway. There was no cabin. There was no fence worth examining. There were only the remains of other people's decisions to give up a few fence posts, gone to rust at their bases, the ghost outline of what had been a hitching rail, and the absolute silence of land that has not been worked in enough years to have forgotten the sound of it. And then I saw the spring. It sat at the foot of the bluff where the water came pushing out of a crack in the limestone, with the patient, unhurried steadiness of something that had been doing exactly this since before there was a county to name it, or a fear to assign to it. The water pooled in a basin perhaps 10 feet across, and it was blue. I want to be careful here, because the word alone cannot carry the full weight of what I mean. It was not the blue of clear sky reflected in still water. It was not the blue of distance, the way far mountains shade toward blue in summer haze. It was blue the way a thing is blue when the earth itself has made it so. Not incidentally, but essentially a deep and luminous color that leaned toward turquoise, where the morning light struck the surface and sank toward something closer to indigo in the shadow beneath the overhang of rock. It looked like a painting made by someone who had decided that nature was too restrained in its choices and had corrected the oversight. I had seen mineral springs before in my years of traveling to people who needed help and could not always come to me. Hot springs and iron springs and springs that tasted of salt and made your skin feel different afterward. I had never seen one this color, and I had never seen one that looked quite so deliberately, almost aggressively like a warning. I approached it the way I had always approached things that required careful attention, Slowly, with my hands open at my sides and my mind in the listening posture I had developed over 40 years of attending to things that did not announce themselves plainly. Not the quiet of nothing happening inside, but the quiet of everything listening at once. I crouched at the rim and looked down through the water to the stones at the bottom, 6 feet at the deepest, and the blue was not sediment and not cloud. The water was clear all the way through, the kind of clarity that only very cold and very pure water achieves. And across the floor of the basin, the small stones wore a pale mineral coating that caught the light and gave it back in tiny points, the way hard frost gives back starlight on a January night. I cupped my palms beneath the surface and brought the water to my face and breathed before I drank. There was no rotten egg smell of sulfur. There was no metal bite of copper. There was no bitterness of iron. What I smelled was stone and cold, and beneath both of those, something faintly sweet. A sweetness with no flower or fruit behind it. The sweetness of mineral dissolved so thoroughly into water, across so much time, that the two had become a single thing, old in a way that made the season and the year and the decade above the surface irrelevant. I did not need a voice from 40 years ago to tell me what to do next. My hands already knew. I drank. It was the coldest water that had ever passed my lips. Cold enough to ache in the back teeth, cold enough to pull the chest tight for one long breath before it released. And it was sweet. Not sugar sweet, not the heavy sweetness of molasses or honey, but the clean mineral sweetness that certain deep springs carry when they have been dissolving limestone and its contents for longer than any mind can hold in a single thought. The blue, whatever it was and wherever the stone had given it, had no flavor I could find. The water was simply water, cold and clean and finer than anything I had drunk in the long, difficult months since George's death, wearing a color it had collected somewhere far below the roots of the mountain. I did not die. I did not sicken. My belly did not cramp and my head did not swim. I drank again and the cold went down through me like a bell struck in a stone room, resonant and clear and still. I sat back on the limestone rim and looked at where the water left the basin in a thread of a creek, crossing my 3 acres and disappearing into another seam in the ground, before it had gone 100 yards. The cove reclaiming its water the way it reclaimed everything in the end. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. The first 2 weeks I lived under a canvas tarp, weighted at its corners with limestone chunks sleeping on the ground, with the spring murmuring 12 feet away, a sound I came to love in those first nights, faster than I had expected to love anything again. I dug a fire pit by feel on the second evening and learned through experiment which of the dead cedar branches burned clean and which smoked in ways that made sleep difficult. I hauled water from the spring in a bucket that Jasper Tull had let me take from a pile behind the assessor's office. Not out of kindness exactly, but out of the particular guilt of a man who knows he has failed to talk someone out of something they perhaps should have been talked out of. My hands blistered and then calloused. The skin on my face went tight with wind and sun in a way I had not felt since the younger decades of farm work. I was 62 years old, and I had not done sustained physical labor in the years since George's health had begun its long decline. And there were mornings when I sat up under my canvas before first light and felt every decade I had lived in the joints of my fingers and the muscles across my lower back, and the particular weariness that is not the tiredness of a single day, but the accumulated weight of a life pressing down all at once in the vulnerable hours before dawn. But there was something underneath the soreness that was not soreness at all. It was the feeling I had not had since the day of the auction, the feeling of building, of putting something somewhere that would remain there the next morning and be added to the morning after that, of working land that was mine in a way no paper document could fully describe mine, because I was the one kneeling in it and learning its resistances and earning inch by inch and morning by morning the right to know what it would and what it would not give. I had brought one thing out of the boarding house that I had not brought from the farm, because it had not come from the farm. I had kept it through the auction in my coat pocket, wrapped in a square of muslin that had belonged to a baby who was now a grown woman with children of her own in Chattanooga. And it had survived the winter in that pocket, the way seeds survive winter in the ground, patient and closed and waiting for the conditions that would unlock them. It was a small paper twist of tomato seeds. They had come from the last summer I spent with Ida Brandt as a neighbor, the summer of 1850, saved from a variety she had grown for as long as she could remember. A great purple shouldered rib tomato, with a flavor so concentrated and individual that she saved its seed each autumn, the way people save letters from persons they love, because what the thing carried was worth the effort of preservation across time. Ida had pressed the paper into my hand the morning she left for Chattanooga to live with her daughter's family in the manner of someone making certain a message arrived at the address it was intended for. She had not spoken directly about the seeds. She had said only as though it were not the main point when it was entirely the main point that some things get better in difficult soil. I had grown those seeds every year for 31 years. Selecting the best fruit seed each autumn and carrying the line forward through seasons of drought and late frost and the ordinary adversity of farming. When the auction came, I had taken the seeds from the pantry before I took anything else, before the good dishes that had been a wedding gift, before the Bible with the family names in the front. The seeds went first into my coat pocket, and they stayed there through everything that followed until I had ground of my own to put them in. I planted that tomato on the 15th day. It was late in the season by any practical measure. Past the window, a sensible gardener with a full larder to protect would have considered safe for starting a tender crop in open ground. A woman with more to lose than I had would have put in something harder and more forgiving. A hill of potatoes. A row of turnips that asked nothing of the soil but room. Practicality felt thin as excuses that day. I had carried those seeds across 31 years and through everything I had been through, and planting them anywhere but in my own ground felt like a betrayal of the only person besides my mother who had ever treated my knowledge as something worth having. I set the seedling 15 feet from the rim of the pool in the damp strip, where the overflow creek kept the thin soil from going entirely to dust. I dug the hole twice as deep as strictly necessary, loosened the clay beneath with a pointed stick, and pressed the seedling in with both thumbs the way my mother had shown me. And her mother had shown her before that firming the soil from the edges inward so the roots had something to push against, rather than collapsing soil around them. Then I hauled the blue water bucket by careful bucket and poured it slow at the base of the plant. Never on the leaves, always at the root the way Ida had taught me you water anything you mean to keep. I told myself I expected nothing. I had the honest conversation with myself that experienced gardeners learn to have in order to survive the heartbreak of a failed planting. The soil was poor. The season was wrong. The plant was fragile and the conditions were marginal, and only a woman with nothing left to protect would be watering a tomato seedling with water the color of something unwell. But the part of me that 40 years of close attention had made impossible to entirely silence watched that little plant with the attentiveness you bring to anything whose outcome matters more than you have admitted out loud. Within 7 days, something occurred that I had no existing framework to receive. The seedling was not simply growing. It was reaching upward with a velocity I had not witnessed in any garden in any season. And I had witnessed a great many of both. In 7 days, it had nearly doubled its height. Not the leggy, desperate doubling of a plant straining toward insufficient light, but the dense, purposeful extension of a plant that has found exactly what it needs and means to make complete use of every particle available to it. The stem thickened in a way visible to the eye across a single day. The leaves broadened and went a dark, saturated green that I had come to associate with abundance rather than effort. When I tested the outer edges of the root zone with careful fingers, the roots had driven outward with an appetite I had no single word for. I stood over it in the gray early light of the 8th morning, my breath making small clouds in the cold air. The spring threw off even in May, and I understood what I was seeing because I had spent a lifetime learning the vocabulary that plants use to describe their conditions. And the vocabulary was this time unambiguous. It was the water. Nothing else explained it. The soil was the same thin, stony ground that had defeated every previous owner of this lot. The sun was the same sun that rose over every farm in the valley. The only variable I had introduced that differed from anything this ground had ever received was the blue water carried from the dark of the mountain each morning and poured at the roots of a plant that was answering it the way a body answers the one remedy that was always right, the one it had needed without knowing what it was waiting for. I am not a woman who trusts a single witness, regardless of how eloquent that witness happens to be. So I tested it the way a careful person tests anything of consequence, with repetition and controlled difference. I planted 2 more rows of seedlings beans on one side and peppers on the other, and I divided each row straight down the middle. The left half I gave the blue spring water each morning carried bucket by patient bucket. The right half I gave rainwater caught in a barrel beneath a slope of canvas, the same plain water that fell on every farm in the cove. Same seed, same soil, same planting date, same hands doing the work. The only difference between the 2 halves of each row was the color of what I poured at their roots. By the end of the first week, the 2 sides were distinguishable to a careful eye. By the end of the second week, they would have been distinguishable to anyone willing to spend 30 seconds looking. The spring-watered plants came up faster, stood taller, and leafed out in a darker and denser green than the rainwater plants in the same soil 2 feet away. The difference was not the difference between a good year and a poor one. It was the difference between adequate nourishment and something a plant had no prior experience of receiving and did not know how to respond to except by growing. I walked those divided rows every morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the gap between the 2 halves widened every day, a living and green record of what the mountain had been offering freely at the foot of that bluff, since before anyone in the cove had been alive to misread it. That was when I made my mistake. A woman who had just demonstrated that the spring water was extraordinary might be forgiven for assuming that more of an extraordinary thing was simply more extraordinary. I had the evidence of my test rows. I had the tomato seedling which had by now produced its first clusters of small flowers and was setting fruit at a speed that looked almost impatient. I had the evidence of my own 40 years of knowing what healthy plants look like. And I made the error that experience sometimes permits, precisely because experience creates the confidence for it. The error of assuming that a principle proven in one set of conditions applies with equal validity to all conditions. I decided to expand the planting. In the second week of June, I put in a full half-acre of mixed vegetables, corn, and squash and beans, and a row of late lettuce along the shaded edge of the lot. And I watered the entire new planting with blue spring water at full concentration. The same water I had been giving the established tomatoes since the beginning. I hauled it morning and evening, bucket after bucket, until my lower back moved past, speaking to me in words, and began communicating in something closer to weather patterns. I was 62 years old, hauling water twice a day across 30 yards of uneven, rocky ground, and my body was registering its position on the matter clearly enough. But the planting was in and the water was going on it, and I told my back it could file its complaints another time. On the 10th day after planting, I saw the first signs that something was wrong. The newly emerged seedlings had an appearance I did not immediately recognize from my experience, because it did not fit any of the failure patterns I knew well. Not the yellowing of nitrogen deficiency, not the wilting of inadequate moisture, not the mottled discoloration of fungal presence. When I carefully lifted one struggling bean seedling to examine the roots, what I found was browning at the outer tips, in a pattern that suggested not starvation but its precise opposite, something given in excess of the capacity to receive it. Something offered before the structures needed to use it had been built. The full-strength mineral water was burning the new root systems of seedlings that had not yet developed the depth or branching to handle what the established tomato with its stronger and more extensive root system had been absorbing and using from the beginning without difficulty. I was seating them at a banquet table before they had learned to swallow. The realization arrived with the sharpness particular to mistakes made from confidence rather than ignorance. Ignorance you can forgive yourself for, because you genuinely did not know. Confidence is harder to forgive because the knowing was supposed to protect you and did not. I pulled every struggling seedling and stood in the middle of my damaged planting with the June sun overhead, and made myself think rather than feel, which is harder than it sounds. When you are looking at 3 weeks of physical effort going gray at the edges, I began the methodical work of finding the right proportion. I replanted in small test batches, each batch receiving a different ratio of spring water to rainwater. 1 part spring to 1 part rain, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4. Watching each station with the same close attention I had brought to the original test rows. I kept notes in a small composition book with a pencil stub. Not because I intended to show them to anyone, but because written observation is more honest than memory. And I needed honesty with myself about what I was actually seeing rather than what I expected to see. 3 weeks of close watching gave me the answer with the clarity that good evidence tends toward when you are patient enough to let it speak for itself. For seedlings in their first 2 weeks in the ground, 1 part spring water to 3 parts rainwater was the working threshold. At that ratio, the mineral richness of the spring water was still present, and active carried into the soil in quantities the young root systems could receive and use without harm. Once a plant had been in the ground for 3 weeks or more and had developed a genuine root system, rather than a fragile first thread, it could handle the full spring water without damage and responded to it with the same dramatic growth. The original tomato had demonstrated from the first week. The original tomato seedling had come through unharmed because it had gone into the ground as an older and more developed transplant with a root system already substantial enough to handle full concentration. The new seedlings had not had that advantage, and I had not thought to account for the difference between them when I expanded. My confidence in the principle had outrun my attention to the particulars. I replanted the half-acre at the correct ratio for each stage of growth, and watched with the specific patience of a woman who has learned that a mistake fully understood is not a mistake waiting to be repeated. By late July, the half-acre was an argument I was winning past any doubt. The first great ripe tomato came in the last days of that month, a fruit that had grown to the size I had been working toward across 31 years of saving its seed and improving its line, a great ribbed purple-shouldered thing, heavy in both hands and warm from the sun. I sat on the rough step of my lean-to and bit into it, and the flavor that flooded my mouth was not simply the flavor of a good tomato. It was the flavor of what a tomato is when every condition has been met at once, when the soil and the water and the deep botanical memory of the seed are all speaking the same language, and the plant has been permitted to become entirely what it was shaped by generations to become. I laughed out loud. Alone on 3 acres of cursed ground, sitting on a roughed cedar step, with juice running warm down my wrist and chin. I laughed in a way I had not laughed since before George's illness began. Its long work on us both. It was not a simple laugh of contentment. It was the helpless laugh of a person whose understanding of what was possible has just been knocked sideways by the evidence of what is actual. The sound a body makes when the world turns out to be larger and stranger, and more generous than every authority in the vicinity swore it could be. The first person to see what I had done with that lot was a boy named Eli Whitfield, 13 years old, grandson of Amos Whitfield, who worked the bottom ground a mile to the west, and who was regarded throughout Grassy Cove as the most level-headed judge of agricultural matters the valley had produced in 2 generations. Eli had been working the base of the bluff with a single-shot rifle hunting squirrels in the cedars, moving with the quiet economy of boys who have learned that unnecessary sound costs them their quarry. And he came around a limestone outcropping and stopped as though he had walked into something solid that had no visible substance. What was in front of him was a thing no living person in Grassy Cove had ever seen on that particular piece of ground. Green. Not the gray green of scrub cedar making dew on thin, stony soil. Not the pale and apologetic green of grass, surviving rather than thriving. The deep, unapologetic, fat green of a garden in its full power. Tomato vines past his shoulder and staked heavy with fruit at every stage of development. Corn throwing up its tassels in the far rows. Bean plants climbing their poles with an ambition that suggested they had not been informed the season was running short. The boy stood with his rifle forgotten at his side, and his mouth working before any sound came out of it. He told me I had done something to the dirt. I told him I had not touched the dirt in any particular way. I had only given it water. He asked if I meant the blue water, and there was real fear in the question. The inherited fear of a child who has been warned off a thing since before he was old enough to understand what made it worth warning against. I told him yes, the blue water. He backed up half a step as though the abundance of the garden itself might carry whatever the blue water was catching. Eli Whitfield ran home and told his grandfather, and his grandfather told the man at the shared fence line, and the story moved through Grassy Cove the way fire moves through dry grass faster than any single person could carry. It carried instead on the collective breath of a community confronted with something that contradicted 100 years of settled certainty. 3 families made the walk to the back of the cove within the week. They came to see, not to buy or to help. They came to stand at the edge of my lot and shake their heads in the way of people confronted with evidence that contradicts something they have believed so long. They had stopped examining whether it deserved to be believed. Among them was Amos Whitfield himself, a tall man, iron-haired and unhurried, with hands that looked purpose-built for evaluating things broad and calloused and certain in their grip. His family had worked the cove since before Tennessee was a state in the full sense. His judgment on matters of soil and crops carried the weight that a doctor's judgment carries on matters of the body. He picked up one of my tomatoes and turned it in his hands, the way a careful man turns a thing he suspects is valuable but has not yet confirmed. He raised it to his mouth and bit. He chewed slowly, and then more slowly, and then he stopped chewing altogether and held the fruit out from his face and looked at it with an expression that moved through several territories I watched without commenting on. The juice ran down into the creases of his knuckles and dripped off the heel of his hand. "Lord have mercy," he said at last, and his voice had gone somewhere quiet and unperformed. "That is the finest tomato I have ever put in my mouth." It was the first time a man of standing in that valley had told me I was right about anything. He said it with juice on his chin, and 100 years of his family's certainty cracking somewhere behind his eyes, in a place I could see from where I was standing, even though no one else in the yard could hear it happening. Abel Drummond came to me the same week. He was a small and weathered man, with the patience of someone who has spent decades paying attention to creatures that require it in large quantities. He kept hives on the mountain above the cove, and he had noticed something that none of his more earthbound neighbors had thought to remark upon. His bees had been finding my garden from 2 miles away, working my late blossoms with a sustained and focused energy he had not witnessed in 50 years of keeping them. He asked if he might bring a few hives down to the edge of the lot, where the bloom was densest. I told him a garden without bees was an argument nobody won, and he was welcome to bring what he needed. The honey those hives produced that autumn was different from anything Abel Drummond had jarred in his years of keeping. Deep amber going toward gold, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, carrying a floral complexity that seemed to contain every flower in my garden at once, with a clean mineral note beneath all of it that no one who tasted it could describe with precision, and no one could stop returning to. Abel called it blue honey, half joking at the name, but the name held the way true names hold, and the honey became something the Cove whispered about in the way of things that exceed the vocabulary available to describe them. It was on the afternoon Abel first brought a jar to show me, standing at the edge of the lot in the September light, with the warm jar between his calloused hands, that I noticed the man at the far boundary of my property. He was broad and well-fed, in a way no farmer in the Cove was well-fed. His coat too fine for the dust of a back road, his boots unmarked by any honest field work. He did not come forward to taste the fruit, or speak to me, or shake his head with the others. He stood apart, and he watched, and behind his flat, pale eyes, something was operating that had nothing to do with wonder and everything to do with the calculation of value and the assessment of distance. When he turned and walked back toward the road, he did not look at me. I would learn that his name was Harlan Crow, and that he held more deeds in Grassy Cove than any other living man, and that he was a person who had never in his life seen something of value in the hands of someone weaker than himself, without beginning to measure the distance between that thing and his own possession. I sat alone on my lean-to step that evening, with the cooling air coming down off the ridges and the spring murmuring behind me, and I held the day in my thinking and turned it over. I had $12 worth of ground and a garden that defied every assumption the valley had held for a century, and a beekeeper whose bees had gone glad in my flowers, and the beginning of something I could feel the shape of, without yet having the full language for it. Somewhere on the road behind me, a man in fine boots was doing his own turning. But what he held in his mind was not what I held in mine. He wanted to own. I wanted to grow. And between those two intentions, across the years already beginning to approach, a whole reckoning would be made over a basin of blue water I had bought for $12 from a man who tried every way he knew to talk me out of spending them. I had spent 40 years knowing something this valley refused to believe. The valley was beginning to understand that it had been wrong. The spring went on pouring its blue water out of the limestone, without consulting anyone's opinion of it, indifferent to seasons and to fear, and to the 100 years of accumulated avoidance that had kept everyone else at a careful distance from its rim. It had been waiting with the patience that only stone and water together can sustain for someone who already knew what it was. I was that someone, and the knowing after 40 years of keeping it quietly in the way of things you carry alone had finally found the ground it needed to root. The autumn of that first full year brought more food than one woman could manage across 3 ordinary winters, and the surplus created the kind of problem I had not thought to plan for, which is the problem of abundance without a direction to send it. I loaded what I could onto a borrowed handcart and walked the long miles to the crossroads, where the main wagon road met the track leading to the high farms. Gerald Pratt kept the general store at that junction, a 2-room establishment with a long porch and a reputation for carrying what a family needed between trips to Pikeville. Pratt himself was a compact, watchful man in his early 40s, with the manner of someone who had decided early that the most profitable position in any situation was the one closest to the money without being the one taking the visible risk. He looked at my tomatoes the way a man looks at something he wants, but has decided in advance to appear indifferent to. He would not buy them outright. He allowed me to set them on his porch on consignment, taking a percentage of whatever sold, certain in his professional judgment that nothing would move in meaningful quantity. Or if it did, the price would not justify the porch space. By the second Saturday, the porch was cleared by noon. The families who had come to gawk at my impossible garden came back as paying customers. And they brought their neighbors, and those neighbors brought their households. And the word moving through the cove was not cursed anymore, but a simpler and more reliable word: good. The tomatoes were good. The peppers were good. The squash and beans and the late ears of corn were good in the way that makes a person stop mid-bite and reconsider what the word had meant before. Abel Drummond's blue honey sold alongside my produce, and the combination drew buyers from 2 valleys over by October. Pratt's certainty about what would sell curdled into something that looked in the right light, like a man reconsidering his prior estimates. I did not fault him for the recalculation. Greed, unlike certain other motivations, is at least straightforward about what it is after. It was on the 3rd Saturday of September, in the particular slant of autumn light that makes the Tennessee hill country look like a painting of itself trying to be remembered, that I first noticed Caleb Marsh. He was not the sort of man who announced his presence. He was tall and deliberate in the way of men whose working life has been spent around wood, who have absorbed through long practice the principle that the measurement you hurry past is the measurement that costs you everything later. He had the hands that came from such work, large and scarred and stained at the knuckles with whatever wood he had been working that week. He appeared to be somewhere around 64, widowed by the look of him, wearing the good coat a man puts on for a Saturday errand and no other occasion. He bought 1 tomato from the porch without examining it first, which told me he had either tasted one before or had made up his mind before he arrived. He stepped off the porch and stood at the edge of the yard in the way quiet people stand at the edge of any gathering present, but not participating, and he ate it there by himself. I was restacking my display when he looked up from the tomato, and I happened to look up at the same moment. The coincidence of attention that occurs between 2 people in proximity when neither is performing anything. He did not look away. Most people, when they find themselves caught looking, manage a polite withdrawal of their eyes into some other direction. Caleb Marsh did not do this. He held my gaze for the duration of 1 full breath with an expression that was not curiosity and was not the flat appraisal of someone pricing a thing. Then he tucked the stem into his coat pocket and walked back toward the road in the unhurried way of a man who knows where he is going and has decided the pace is his own business. I thought about it on the walk home and then set it aside because there was too much else requiring immediate attention. The most immediate was Harlan Crow. He came up my cow path on the 2nd morning of October, walking rather than arriving on horseback, which I registered as a deliberate choice intended to look like a neighborly visit rather than a formal approach. He had arranged his face into warmth for the occasion, the broad and well-fed face capable of it, the way faces are capable of arrangements that are not quite the same as feelings. His boots were still unmarked by any honest field. He had chosen a coat a degree plainer than the one he had worn the first time I saw him at the edge of my lot. Another deliberate choice. He introduced himself as a neighbor and expressed admiration for what I had done with a difficult piece of ground. He accepted the blue water I offered him and drank it without comment, which cost him something I could read plainly, because he had spent years believing it was poison, and the act of drinking required him to operate against that belief in front of me without admitting it. He moved toward his offer the way careful men move toward things they want and are not entirely certain they can take. He spoke about the difficulties facing a woman managing alone the wisdom of converting an asset at its highest point, rather than holding it through the uncertainty of coming seasons. He named a figure that made the interior of my chest go briefly cold, not from temptation, but from the clarity of understanding it brought the sudden, precise knowledge of exactly what he calculated this spring to be worth in his own reckoning. A man like Harlan Crow does not offer a fortune for 3 acres of stony ground unless he has calculated already that the ground will return him 10 fortunes. Once the woman who does not understand what she is sitting on has been moved gently out of the way. I understood exactly what I was sitting on. I told him I had bought this ground with my last $12 and intended to be buried in it. I said it without heat because heat in that conversation would have been information freely given to someone who would have used it. He smiled in the way of men who believe a refusal is merely the beginning of a different kind of negotiation. He told me that a spring of water was a complex matter in mountain law, that questions of source and rightful ownership were not always as clear as a deed might suggest, that it was better to settle these things agreeably before they required other means of settlement. There was no threat in his voice, and that was the worst part of the encounter. The composed certainty of a man who had dismantled other people's holdings before and saw no reason this particular arrangement should conclude differently. I told him the deed was as sound in my hand as in his, that $12 was as lawful as any 1,000 he might offer, and that this property was not available at any price he was positioned to name. He tipped his hat with a courtesy that left a cold sensation behind. It turned and walked back down the cow path, and I understood with the clarity that a lifetime of reading human nature eventually produces that I had not seen the last of him. I had only seen the version of him he had believed would be sufficient. The rumor arrived before the second hard frost. It moved through Grassy Cove, the way bad news moves through small communities, faster than a single carrier could manage, with the particular velocity of something that has been given a helpful direction from behind. A child on a farm at the north end of the cove had taken ill after eating from a garden watered with the spring. A man's hogs had sickened. The blue water that grew the remarkable tomatoes was slow poison after all. And any family still buying the old widow's produce or pouring her water onto their kitchen beds was inviting consequences they would not understand until it was too late to reverse them. There was no ill child. I knew this the way you know things that would have reached you by now if they were real. In a valley this size, a sick child has a mother and a name and neighbors who appear with food and questions within the day. There were no dead hogs. There was no North Road family that could be located and spoken to. But a lie does not need to be true to work. Within one Saturday, the traffic at Pratt's porch was half what it had been. Within 2, it was a quarter. Pratt himself began suggesting, with the apologetic manner of a man rehearsing a feeling he does not actually have, that our arrangement had perhaps run its natural course. I went looking for the origin of the rumor. With the same patient attention I had brought to the failing seedlings earlier that season, I asked questions sideways rather than directly in the manner of someone whose curiosity appears casual. And what I assembled over the course of a week was a shape I had not expected to find. The story had not originated on any farm. It had come from Pratt's store itself, released into conversation from behind the counter. The way things are released when someone with access to a community's daily gathering point lets them fall deliberately in the right direction. And Pratt was Harlan Crow's brother-in-law. He had married Crow's younger sister 15 years before, and the relationship between the two men ran underneath the surface of their separate public roles. In the cove, the way underground water runs beneath limestone, invisible and connecting things that appear separate from above, Crow had not needed to spread a rumor himself. He had a man at the crossroads who would carry it in the ordinary course of keeping a store, and no one would think to trace the thread back to family, because family is the connection people are least likely to examine when they are looking for the source of something. I stood in my lean-to with this understanding and let it sit completely before I decided what to do with it. Then I loaded the cart. The following Saturday, I brought the finest produce my garden had given in 2 full years of working it. The great purple-shouldered tomatoes and peppers the color of late embers and squash that required both arms to carry comfortably. I set up not on Pratt's porch but in the road alongside it, which was public ground and required no arrangement with any man. I gave everything away. Not 1 cent changed hands. I pressed a tomato into the hand of every person who came past, and I ate from each one first, biting deliberately in full view before I extended the rest into their hands. I spoke plainly to the gathered crowd. I had been watering my garden with the blue spring water for 2 full years. I drank it myself every morning of those 2 years. If this water was death, I told them, looking at the faces in front of me without flinching, then I had been dying for 2 years, and had never in my life felt more completely alive. I was 63 years old, and doing the physical work of 3 people on ground that every previous owner had abandoned, and I asked them to look at me and determine for themselves whether a poisoned woman looked like what they were looking at. The crowd was not entirely won back that morning. A rumor with a wealthy man's construction behind it does not collapse in a single public demonstration. But I put a doubt into the doubt, a crack into the certainty of the counter story. And in the weeks that followed, a different kind of talk began to move through the cove. The talk was that the old woman from Mason County had eaten her own produce in public without hesitating, that the sick child and the dead hogs had no name and no farm attached to them that anyone could actually locate. That Pratt had been less comfortable meeting eyes lately when the subject came up in his store. I needed more than a brave Saturday. I needed something the rumor's architecture could not absorb or redirect. That something arrived in September of 1883. Dr. Samuel Briggs came up my cowpath on a hired horse with a leather case strapped behind the saddle and the careful, understated clothing of a man who spent his working life with instruments rather than weather. He was a professor of natural philosophy and mineral chemistry at the State University in Knoxville, and he had heard about my garden from a man with the County Agricultural Society who had heard of it from Amos Whitfield, who had not found a way to stop talking about a tomato that had rearranged his understanding of what the word was supposed to contain. Briggs introduced himself with none of the assessing quality I had learned to read in men who wanted something from me. His eyes moved across my garden with the particular restless attention of someone who has spent a life asking not what is occurring, but why. He asked whether he might examine the spring, the soil, and the fruit. He asked this with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that the permission was mine to give or withhold, which after 2 years of being told what I could not hold and had no right to keep was a consideration so unexpected that I had to take a small breath before I could answer him. He spent 3 days on my land. On the second afternoon, I watched him uncap a small glass vial and hold it above the surface of the pool and allow 3 drops to fall into the water. The drops spread outward from where they struck. The color that bloomed from that point was orange, not an ambiguous or faint orange. A clean, fully saturated orange, the color a chemist recognizes as the signature of a specific substance present in a concentration that requires no hedging. Briggs went still. He did not speak. He did not reach for his notebook. He did not prepare another test or move to another instrument. He stood at the rim of that pool with the empty vial in one hand and watched the orange fade slowly back into the blue. And for a full minute he was absent from the ordinary world in the way of a person whose understanding has just been required to make room for something it had not previously accommodated. Then he sat down. Not on the flat rock at the pool's edge. He sat directly onto the ground with his leather case still on his shoulder, as though the decision had been made by his legs independently of the rest of him. He told me he had been testing mineral springs across 6 states over the course of 20 years as part of a long-term study of natural water chemistry and its relationship to agricultural productivity. He had measured springs with elevated calcium, springs with unusual iron concentrations, springs identified by other researchers as potentially beneficial for irrigation. He had never seen a balance like this, not once in 20 years of looking. I stood beside the pool and said nothing because it was not a moment for words. It was a moment for allowing a truth that had been waiting a very long time to be formally acknowledged to receive the silence it had earned. What Briggs found across 3 full days of measurement was this. The water rising through the limestone crack carried a profile of dissolved minerals that no farmer alive could have deliberately assembled in a single preparation. Calcium and potassium and phosphorus and iron, and a catalog of trace elements besides, held in a proportion so well matched to what plants need at their roots that a deliberate formulation by an agricultural chemist would have aspired to approach it rather than improve upon it. The water had traveled miles through some of the richest limestone in the region, dissolving the mineral substance of the mountain at every foot of the passage, arriving at the surface loaded with nourishment that would have cost a careful man a significant sum to spread across a single acre by hand. The blue came from a mineral compound called vivianite, an iron phosphate that forms in deep airless limestone and dissolves into moving water at low but consistent concentrations. At the levels present in my spring, it was entirely harmless to any living creature that consumed it. It was also the mineral most directly responsible for the extraordinary phosphorus content that had been driving the growth I had observed since the first week. The color that had terrified 100 years of sensible people was the signature of the very thing that made the water extraordinary. He asked whether he might submit a formal account to the learned societies, and whether I had any objection to my name appearing in it. I told him I had no objection whatsoever to the truth being set down in permanent record, with my name attached to it. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Crow would move to use Briggs' visit before Briggs had completed his work. The professor had barely cleared the valley when a new story began moving through the cove, more sophisticated than dead hogs and sick children, because it wore borrowed scientific authority rather than plain rumor clothing. The university professor the story went had confirmed the spring's danger. His instruments had detected harmful substances. A formal petition was being prepared to restrict the sale of spring water and spring-watered produce until independent study could be conducted. None of this was true. Briggs had said none of it and found none of it. But Crow had learned the man's name and institution, and the fact of his visit, and he had built a false structure around those true facts. The oldest variety of lie because it borrows its plausibility from the very thing it is designed to invert. Briggs rode back to Knoxville with his samples and his notebooks and his orange-stained vial, promising to write when his analysis was complete. I watched him go down the cowpath and felt the particular exposed sensation of a woman who is committed to a truth that is still being assembled and cannot yet speak on its own behalf. I went back to work. The cold arrived early that year. A hard frost 2 weeks before the almanac suggested it had reasonable grounds to appear. I had been expanding my winter, growing with increasing ambition, encouraged by the spring water's stable temperature, to push the season further than mountain farmers in the cove thought worth attempting. I had built cold frames along the south-facing base of the limestone bluff, wooden boxes topped with salvaged glass, angled to catch the winter sun, holding lettuces and spinach and late kale. The frames represented 2 solid weeks of labor and more sustained physical effort than my hands and back had been asked for in some years. The frost came in the night harder than the ground could absorb at once. When I came out in the early morning, the frames had collapsed. The wooden walls had warped and split as the mineral-rich soil inside froze and expanded in a pattern distinct from ordinary ground, holding its moisture longer because of its composition, and releasing it with damaging force when the temperature dropped past the threshold. The glass was broken on 2 of the 5 frames. 3 weeks of lettuces and spinach lay black and flat in the gray light. I stood looking at it for a long time. I was 64 years old, The joints of my hands had been carrying an ache since the first cool weather. A deepening ache that was not new but had sharpened over the previous year in the way of things that have decided to be permanent. That morning, the cold was sitting in those joints the way cold settles into a stone wall. Not at the surface, but throughout. I stood before the broken frames and the blackened lettuces and the broken glass, and allowed myself to feel in my body what I had not allowed myself to feel in my thinking, the plain fact of how much this was costing. Then I went for the tools. I worked through that day and into the following one, tearing out the broken frames and rebuilding from scavenged cedar and new poles cut at the bluff. My hands locked and released in the cold that particular conversation between cold weather and a certain kind of body at a certain age. I worked through the locking and releasing, fitting each joint of the rebuilt frames with deliberate care, because rushing in that cold with those hands produced errors that cost more time than the rushing saved. On the second night, crouched in the dark with a lantern propped against the limestone, my breath making clouds in its light, I noticed the spring. It was running its channel at the same temperature it always maintained regardless of the air above or the season or the frost that had destroyed my frames and settled into the joints of my hands. The spring water held at a stable temperature throughout the year, cold but never at freezing the depth of the limestone, ensuring a consistency that the surface world did not offer. The realization did not arrive as a question. It arrived as a clarity that comes after sufficient time spent cold and tired and honest with oneself about a problem. What if the water itself was the protection? I redirected the channel. Instead of carrying the spring water away from the bluff at right angles toward the garden beds, I cut new shallow courses along the outer perimeter of each rebuilt frame, letting the water flow continuously along the outside of the wooden walls, before rejoining the main channel farther downstream. The water was not warm by any comfortable definition, but it was many degrees warmer than the air that had killed my lettuces, and moving water resists freezing in ways that still air does not. And moving water at a consistent temperature along the base of a frame changes what happens to the soil and the plants inside it during a hard night. The next hard frost came 3 days after I finished. The frames held. The lettuces inside them held. The spinach survived. The soil temperature inside the frames, which I had begun measuring with a thermometer borrowed from Abel Drummond, stayed above the killing threshold through a night that put ice 2 inches thick on the rain barrel at the far end of the lot. I sat in the early morning after that frost on the limestone beside my frames in the cold, with the spring running its thin protective channel along their bases, and the lettuces green inside them, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved correctly. It is a satisfaction that does not diminish with age. In my experience, it intensifies because age teaches you how rarely it occurs and how much it costs to arrive at it. That technique became the first lesson of the Saturday classes I began holding at the lot in the spring of 1884. The legal papers arrived in November of 1883, delivered by a constable who looked genuinely uncomfortable on my property, which I noted as a point in his favor and an accurate indicator of what he was carrying. Harlan Crow had filed a claim of ownership to the spring. His argument was carefully constructed. The underground sources feeding my pool originated on the lots above mine, on the bluff. Lots he held by deed, and in mountain law, the owner of the ground where a spring originates holds rights to the water wherever it surfaces. He owned the stone above, therefore he owned the water in it. The spring surfaced on my land by accident of geology, his lawyers argued, and the deed I held gave me no claim to a resource originating elsewhere. It was a well-made argument. I will not pretend otherwise. The kind of argument that wins when the only thing set against it is the word of a woman alone. I spent 2 full days in the county records office in Pikeville with the patient attention of someone who has learned that the truth tends to be in the file that has not been looked at recently. I was searching for any documentation bearing on the spring's legal history, any survey notation or boundary record that had something specific to say about how the spring had been treated in the formal county record. I found it on the second afternoon in a box of survey records from the county's early establishment years filed between boundary descriptions for other Eastern Cove lots. It was a surveyor's map from 1841, drawn with the precise and deliberate care of that period, showing the properties at the eastern edge of the cove as they had been parceled when the region was first formally divided. The map showed in detail the point where my spring appeared at the foot of the bluff, and at that point the original surveyor had written a notation in careful hand. Blue Spring and its waters expressly excluded from upper parcel deed, retained in perpetuity with lower parcel. The man who divided these lots in 1841 had known the spring existed. He had made a deliberate legal decision to ensure that whoever held the lower lot held the spring itself, not merely the surface it happened to break through, but the spring by explicit and formal intention. There was one more thing about that map, and it was the thing that made me sit very still in that records room for a full minute before I allowed myself to fully understand it. The map appeared in the county records as part of the exhibit package that Crow's own lawyers had submitted to the court when they filed his claim. They had gathered every survey document related to the Eastern Cove lots to establish ownership history, and they had included this 1841 map in the submission without reading the notation at the spring location carefully enough to understand what it said. Harlan Crow had delivered the instrument of his own legal undoing to the courthouse himself. He had simply not read what was in the bundle he was carrying. I carried a copy of that map out of the records room. Dr. Briggs' completed letter had been waiting at the post office for me since the previous week. I sat with both documents on the table in my lean-to and spent a deliberate hour reading and rereading them. Not because I needed to understand them better, but because I wanted to understand them completely before I read them aloud to other people in a formal setting. The trial was held on a Thursday morning in February of 1884 in the Bledsoe County Courthouse in Pikeville, a building that carried in its bones the particular serious density of a place where consequential decisions have been made over a long period of time. It was packed. Farmers and their families from across the cove had come to see which direction the weight would fall. Crow arrived with his hired attorney and a retained surveyor and a collection of documents going back 20 years. He sat at his table with the composed ease of a man who has bought enough outcomes to recognize the feeling of one approaching from the expected direction. I arrived with no lawyer because I could not afford one. I arrived with the letter from Dr. Samuel Briggs of the State University, and I arrived with the 1841 survey map from the county's own records, the map that Crow's own lawyers had filed with the court, without understanding what the notation on it meant. The hired attorney spoke first and at considerable length. He built the argument stone by stone in the practiced manner of someone paid to make one position sound like the only position that honesty would permit. He spoke about mountain water law and the doctrine of source ownership and the precedents supporting his client's position. He spoke well. I listened to all of it without letting my expression change, because expression is information, and I was not giving information away in that room. When my turn came, I did not argue law. I was not a lawyer and would not pretend to be one. I rose and asked the court's leave to read a letter from a professor of mineral chemistry at the State University, and I watched Harlan Crow go very still at his table, because he understood in that moment that the scientific authority he had tried to borrow and use against me had completed its work and was now standing in the room facing the opposite direction from the one he had pointed it toward. I read Briggs's account into the silence of that courtroom. The Vivianite and its harmlessness, the dissolved minerals and their extraordinary profile, the miles of limestone passage, the 20 years of comparison against every other spring the professor had measured, and the conclusion in Briggs's measured language, the most nutrient-rich natural irrigation water he had measured in a professional career, spent measuring such things. I read the section where Briggs addressed the question of underground sources in limestone country and stated plainly that subterranean passages in karst geology cannot be traced by any instrument a surveyor carries, and that the spring belonged in every meaningful sense to the ground in which it surfaced. Then I set down the letter and picked up the 1841 map. I placed it before the judge and pointed to the notation in the original surveyor's hand, written 43 years earlier in ink old, but entirely legible, by a man who had stood on that ground and made a legal decision that had outlasted his own name in the county's memory. I told the court that this document had been filed by the plaintiff's own attorneys as part of their exhibit package. I suggested the court examine the notation with some attention. The hired attorney rose to object. He had run out of the material that makes an objection hold, and it dissolved in the air between his table and the bench. The judge took the map in his own hands and read it. He read the letter from Briggs a second time. He set both documents side by side before him and looked at them for a time that stretched long enough for the room to arrive at the particular silence of a crowd waiting for a weight to settle on one side or the other of a balance. He ruled that afternoon in the plain and unhurried manner of a mountain man who has weighed two things and found one of them heavier. He ruled that a spring surfacing on a lawfully held lot belonged to the holder of that lot. He ruled that the 1841 survey notation was a binding legal instrument establishing the spring's attachment to the lower parcel, and that no subsequent deed affecting the upper lots could override a provision so explicitly and formally made. He ruled that the blue spring of Grassy Cove and all waters arising from it were the lawful property of Wanda Birch. He spoke my name in that room, before the assembled cove, against the wealthiest man in 3 counties. And I heard it land the way true things land, without flourish, without the need for additional weight, simply and with the finality of something that has been a long time arriving at the place it belonged. Crow left the courtroom without looking at me. The composed ease was gone, replaced by something rigid and controlled that I recognized as the fury of a man who has arranged the world to produce a particular outcome and found his arrangement declined. I knew his fury was not concluded, but I had won. The cove had watched me win. The woman they had warned off the cursed lot had walked into a courthouse with 2 pieces of paper and walked out still owning her water. There was one face in that courtroom I had not expected. Near the back in the last row stood Caleb Marsh, still wearing the good coat he reserved for Saturday errands. He had come to Pikeville on his own with no word from me and no warrant I had given him. And he had stood at the back of that room and watched a woman he had seen eat tomatoes alone in a public road stand up before a judge with nothing but the truth and the truth's documents and prevail. When I caught his eye across the room, he did not look away. He held my gaze and nodded once, the particular nod of someone marking not a small or ordinary thing, but a true one. Then the departing crowd moved between us, and he was gone. And I walked out of that courthouse alone into the February cold, with my letter and my map and my ruling in my hands. Alone was how I had arrived at most of the important days of my life. It had stopped being frightening some considerable time before. On that afternoon, walking out of the Bledsoe County Courthouse with the wind off the ridge cutting through my coat and the deed to the Blue Spring in my possession, beyond anyone's further argument, it felt like something closer to the right condition for the moment than company would have been. 2 weeks after the courthouse ruling, Caleb Marsh came up my cowpath at first light on a March morning carrying a wagon of cut cedar and a look of settled purpose that indicated he had already considered every reasonable objection and found none that required him to change course. He told me he was not there to negotiate. He had decided before he arrived. A woman who had been declared the lawful owner of the most valuable spring in 3 counties should not spend another winter under canvas. And he had spent his working life building things, and he wanted to build one thing in his life entirely, because the building was worth doing rather than because he had been paid to do it. I told him I had no money for a carpenter's wages. He told me he had not mentioned wages. I looked at this man who had eaten one of my tomatoes alone in a public road without asking my permission, who had appeared at the back of a courtroom without my knowledge, and nodded at me across the room with the gravity of someone marking something he intended to remember. And I told him the water was in the spring, and the cedar poles were already cut, and he was welcome to start. He built the cabin in 2 months. 2 rooms with walls thick enough to make a real difference in a winter, and a porch that faced the bluff, so the morning light came in off the pale limestone and filled the front of the house before the sun was fully up. He measured each piece of the work twice before he cut it once, and he fitted his joints with the close attention of a man for whom imprecision was not simply an aesthetic failure, but a small moral one, a failure to do fully what you had set out to do. He spoke very little while he worked and said everything necessary through the quality of what he made. On the day the roof went on, I brought him water from the spring at midday. The blue water in the tin cup I used myself each morning. He took it and looked at it a moment, the way a person regards something whose reputation has arrived before it. And then he knelt at the rim of the pool in the posture I had knelt in 3 years before. And he drank. He was quiet for a long while, looking into the blue. Some things are too lovely to keep in the dark, he said finally, and his voice was the voice he used when he was not arranging himself for company. The plain voice of a man in his own thinking. The cove kept this in the dark 100 years. I will not do it for one more day. He built the spring house the following spring in the 3rd month after we married, raised over the pool itself with walls of fitted limestone, quarried from the bluff, and a roof of salvaged glass panels set at an angle to catch the southern light. Standing inside the spring house on a clear day, you could look down through the glass at the blue moving beneath you. In the pool, the way light moves in clear, shallow water, when the sun finds the right angle, that particular wavering luminescence that makes the ground beneath your feet feel animate and permanent at the same time. It became the thing people came to remember most about our property, the little stone building where you could stand over the mountain's gift and watch it glow blue beneath your feet, where what the limestone had been keeping in the dark for a century came up into the light through a crack in the rock and showed itself to anyone willing to look. We were married in the early summer of 1884. A small gathering at the crossroads with Amos Whitfield as witness and Abel Drummond's bees working the clover in the field across the road. I became Wanda Birch Marsh, a name with a man folded carefully into it, and I was 65 years old, and what I felt at that crossroads was not what I had felt at 18, which was partly innocence and partly the honest ignorance of someone who does not yet know what she is agreeing to. What I felt at 65 was the specific solidity of a choice made with complete knowledge of its weight and the deliberate decision to take it on anyway. Caleb extended the channel system through the following seasons with the same patient care he brought to everything, quarrying the limestone from the bluff and fitting the courses without mortar so true to level and grade that the water found its way through them without losing a drop to seepage or pooling. He found in the work of the channel courses the same satisfaction I found in a well-tended row, the satisfaction of understanding a natural process well enough to give it a more useful direction without forcing it against its own nature. The Saturday classes grew through 1885 and into 1886 until they were not classes in any formal sense, but a weekly practice, a gathering of people who came because what was being taught was worth knowing and was not available anywhere else for any price. Families drove and walked from distances that surprised me in the early years. I taught everything I knew, which was everything Ida Brandt had given me, added to everything 40 years of paying close attention had taught me on top of that. The spring water techniques in full detail, the rotation of crops through the beds, The composting of kitchen and garden waste into the dark amendment that took dead things and transformed them into what fed living ones. The cold frame insulation method that extended the growing season past what the almanac considered possible. The dilution ratios for different stages of plant development. All of it given freely, given completely. I charged nothing. This was not a strategic choice about market positioning. It was the only arrangement that felt honest. Ida Brandt had given me her knowledge without a cent changing hands, in the way of someone who understood that knowledge kept to a single person dies with that person, and knowledge given away multiplies in ways the giver will never live long enough to fully witness. I owed the same debt in the same direction, and the only honest way to pay it was without keeping an account of what it cost me. Harlan Crow watched from the distance he had retreated to after the courthouse. His hold on the cove had been loosening since the verdict, loosening the way authority loses its grip when the thing that sustained it, the belief that it cannot be successfully opposed, has been publicly and permanently disproven. Farmers who had spoken his name quietly now spoke it at ordinary volume. Renters who had paid on time out of fear now paid when it suited them and offered reasonable explanations rather than apologies. He had lost the spring and he had lost the reputation for invulnerability that mattered to a man like him more than any individual piece of property. But he had not stopped moving. The drought arrived in the summer of 1887. Without the usual warning signs, the creek levels dropping faster than the dry season alone explained the wells on the high farms going down past the reach of the bucket by the end of July. The corn on the ridge farms tasseled early. The gesture of a plant that has decided to seed before it dies, to make that one final effort toward continuation before the moisture runs entirely out. The thin soil cracked, and the old fear came back into the cove. Not the fear of blue water, but the older and more fundamental fear of what happens when the rains stop and the food stores run thin and winter approaches with less than what is needed to reach the other side of it. My spring did not fail. It poured its blue water out of the crack in the limestone at the same rate it always had, drawing from a source so deep in the rock that no drought measured in seasons could reach it. The garden around the pool stayed green, while the farms on the valley floor went brown and brittle. The tomatoes ripened. The beans produced. The corn grew to its full height, fed by water that the drought above the surface had no access to. I understood what this meant before Caleb said it, and he said it quietly one evening in the second week of July, standing at the edge of the garden, looking out at the surrounding valley. He told me I was holding the difference between a hard winter and a deadly one for every family in the cove. I already knew. I had been knowing it for 2 weeks. I could have sold the water at the price desperation would pay. That price would have been considerable. By August of a second drought year, it would have been very nearly anything I chose to name. Instead, I filled jugs until my arms would not close properly. And then I rested and filled more. And I lined them at the crossroads without a price attached to any of them. I gave away seedlings already a foot tall, and thick stems started in the spring-watered beds. I held additional sessions of the Saturday classes through the week for families who could not make the regular walk. Among the families who came to the crossroads that first drought summer was Martha Evers, a widow of 40 with 3 children. The oldest was a girl named Pearl, 12 years old, with the particular focused attentiveness of a child who has understood early that her family's circumstances require her to learn things at a rate that children in easier situations do not need to match. Martha arrived with the specific dignity of a woman who needs help and has decided to receive it without manufacturing shame about the need, which is one of the harder things to do and one of the more necessary. She took the jugs and the seedlings and asked careful questions about the spring water technique and wrote the answers in a small book she carried. Pearl stood beside her mother and listened to everything. The second drought year was harder than the first. By June, the high farm wells had failed entirely. Families who had managed the first dry year by careful rationing came to the crossroads with less than they had brought before, and the calculations for the coming winter were visible on every face. Pearl came to help fill the jugs, and I told her the buckets were at the channel, and she should work from left to right. She worked from left to right, without complaint, and at the end asked if she could come back the following week. I told her the path was the same every week and the work would be waiting. She came every week after that, and by the end of that second drought summer, she was arriving before I came out already at the channel in the early morning, working with the focused economy of someone who has stopped thinking about the work and started thinking through it toward what the work is for. Caleb found me one evening filling the 30th jug of the day, my back having passed the point of complaint into the territory of simply bearing what it was being asked to bear. He stood and watched me fill the 31st, and then knelt beside me and took the next bucket from my hands and began filling himself. He asked in the way he asked things that mattered, without judgment, but with genuine curiosity, whether I understood that I was giving away everything that made my position in the cove different from everyone else's. I straightened with the jug in my arms and told him what I had known since before I knew him. Ida Brandt gave me everything she knew, I told him. She never charged me a cent for it. She said once that knowledge kept to yourself is knowledge that dies with you and goes into the ground as wasted as unplanted seed in a sealed jar. I think water is the same as knowledge. Hoard it and it stagnates. Give it away and it runs clean forever. Caleb looked at me across the channel in the late light of that drought summer evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the jug he had just filled and looked at the blue water moving in the channel between us. When he spoke, it was in the voice he used for the things he had thought about until they were fully formed. This water was always good, he said. We were only afraid of the color. He looked up at me. You were not. I did not answer because the truth of it did not require one. He picked up an empty jug and we filled the porch at the crossroads together. Until full dark, the two of us pouring out whatever advantage the spring gave us into the hands of the valley. And we came home in the dark to a table that was never empty, because the spring that fed our neighbors also fed our own ground. And what you give from genuine abundance does not diminish the abundance. When the rains came back, the cove did not forget what had happened during the years they were absent. In communities as small and long-memoried as Grassy Cove, what a person does in the hard years is what they are, not what they claim to believe, not what they were seen doing in the easy years when generosity cost nothing because the cost is not real. What you did when the wells were dry and the price of water was everything a family needed for the coming winter. That is the ledger people read when they are assessing what someone is worth to the community they share. What I had done was give it away. Harlan Crow had watched me do it. And he had understood in the watching that the leverage he had intended to use against me had shifted to the other side of the fulcrum while he was focused on the drought. He made one final attempt, and it was the most sophisticated thing he attempted in all the years of trying. In the spring of 1889, he went to the County Board of Commissioners with a petition, prepared by a hired legal mind over the winter. The petition argued that the Blue Spring had demonstrated during the drought years that it constituted an essential resource for the public welfare of the valley, and that resources of this nature, whose benefit extended beyond any single holder to the entire community, ought to be administered by the county as a public utility subject to county oversight and distribution management. It did not argue against my ownership directly. It offered instead to reframe the spring as a resource that had transcended individual ownership through its demonstrated public importance. He held influence over 2 of the 3 county commissioners. He had counted the votes before he filed. What he had not done was check the county clerk's filing records from the previous autumn. 6 months before his petition arrived at the county board in the fall of 1888, At the end of the second drought year, I had filed the formation documents for the Grassy Cove Water Cooperative with the county clerk. The cooperative was a formal legal entity under the applicable Tennessee statutes, with 23 founding member families from across the valley. The spring and its water had been conveyed to the cooperative by deed, and the cooperative held the property in collective title, with the founding members and their successors in interest as joint beneficiaries. The spring was no longer solely my private property when Crow's petition arrived. It was the collective property of 23 families held in a legal structure that had been on the county record for 6 months. A petition to declare it a public utility administered by the county would have required the county to proceed against the recorded property interests of 24 families, not against one woman alone. The board tabled the petition at its first reading. No formal vote was taken. The arithmetic had changed while Crow was writing his documents, and he had not thought to verify it before he filed. Amos Whitfield told me about the tabling with the quiet, settled satisfaction of a fair man who had watched an unfair one run out of ground. Crow had one more thing left in him, and it came in the dark as the last things left to a diminished man often do. On a morning in early May of 1889, I came to the spring house before the sun had cleared the ridge and found the channel Caleb had built from the bluff damaged. The fitted limestone courses had been broken in 3 places. The stones knocked out of their careful setting and scattered across the spring bed. A sack of something fouling had been emptied at the head of the pool, where the water came up from the rock, and the blue had gone gray and clouded at the point of contamination, the muddied smear spreading outward from the source in the early light. I stood at the edge of the spring house for a long time without moving. There are moments when the thing you have built, and the thing you feared losing, and the thing you have defended across years of sustained effort converge into a single image of damage, and the mind goes very quiet in that convergence. Not from despair, but from a kind of reckoning that has no room for noise. Then I went in and began the work of clearing what could be cleared, and waiting for what could not be hurried. The spring flushed itself. Within 2 days, the steady upward pressure of water through the limestone had pushed the contamination out of the pool and down the channel, to where the overflow disappeared into the ground, and the blue returned to the pool, the way it always returned, completely, and without qualification, as though the mountain had considered the intrusion and simply continued what it had been doing for centuries before anyone thought to interfere with it. Caleb rebuilt the channel stronger than it had been, adding a second row of fitted limestone above the first, so that any future attempt would require dismantling twice the material. He worked with the steady anger of a careful man whose careful work has been deliberately undone by someone who knew what care had gone into it. The Cove made its judgment in the way of rural communities not through courts or public proclamations, but through the quiet reordering of ordinary dealings. Crow's tenant farmers became slow to pay their rents. His neighbors became slow to acknowledge him. The men who had once deferred to his opinion on Cove matters found other things to weigh it against, and found other things heavier. His holdings, which had once produced the returns of a man with leverage over his community, produced instead the returns of a man from whom the community has quietly withdrawn the cooperation that made the leverage real. He had spent years trying to break something. The mountain refused to let break, and the breaking had returned to him. James Crow came up my cowpath for the first time in the spring of 1891, alone on foot, wearing work clothes plain and clean, and deliberately different from the fine coats that had been his father's chosen presentation to the world. He was 23, with his father's broad build, and none of his father's flatness of expression. His face was the face of a person still in the process of deciding what kind of man to be, and who had recently made at least one significant decision about the direction. His father had come a week before to ask. Harlan Crow had aged in the years since the courthouse. The composure that had once been his most unsettling quality had settled into something quieter and less managed. the composure of a man who has exhausted certain ambitions and found the space they occupied unfilled by anything in particular. His boots were scuffed now. He stood in my dooryard without the appraising posture of his earlier visits, and spoke without the layered care of a man conducting a negotiation. He told me his son wanted to learn. He told me James had watched what the spring had done for the cove through the drought years and had decided that working with the land, working with what the land actually offered rather than simply holding title to it, was what he wanted to do with the years ahead of him. He told me he had told his son there was only one teacher in Bledsoe County worth the asking, and that the teacher was the woman he had spent a decade trying to ruin. He said this without the architectural courtesy of his earlier visits, because the architecture had come down. What was underneath it was an old man who had used his best energy on the wrong things for too long, and was asking me to teach his child the right ones. I looked at Harlan Crow standing humbled in my dooryard, the man who had offered me a fortune and then manufactured a rumor and then filed a lawsuit and then emptied a sack of filth into the head of my spring, asking now if I would teach his son the very knowledge he had spent years trying to take from me. There is a victory that tastes of triumph and a rarer kind that tastes of something quieter. What I felt standing in my dooryard that morning was the second kind. Not the satisfaction of a balance sheet finally corrected, but something closer to the feeling of a field the morning after rain, where something that was impossible yesterday has become possible simply because the conditions have changed. I told him to send James on Saturday. I told him I did not hold a grudge against a son for his father's fears. The water had never poisoned anyone, and neither would the teaching. James came every Saturday for 5 years. He came with the attentiveness of someone who has something to prove to himself, rather than to others. And he worked with his hands in the soil alongside the other families who came each week. And he asked questions in the way his father never had, with genuine uncertainty about the answers rather than the performance of curiosity. He had an aptitude for systems in the way that some people have an aptitude for music, an ability to hear the whole structure when others were still learning individual notes. He looked at the spring and the channel, and the cooperative and the distribution of water to the member farms, and thought about it the way an engineer thinks, as a question of how to move something valuable from where it is to where it needs to be as efficiently and completely as possible. He began sketching in the margins of his notes during sessions, small drawings of pipe layouts and junction configurations and calculations for gradient and pressure, working out what it would take to carry the spring water, not just through the hand-cut channels on my 3 acres, but through a network of buried pipe to the member farms across the valley, so that the water that had saved the cove in the drought years would be available to every member farm without requiring anyone to walk to the crossroads with a borrowed bucket. In the spring of 1896, with the cooperation of the 23 member families and 3 men, he persuaded to help with the laying. James Crow built the pipe system. It took the full spring season. It was not delicate work. It required the digging of trenches in ground that had not been opened before, and there were days of hard, muddy labor that tested the willingness of everyone involved. But when it was done, the blue water from the pool in my spring house ran through buried clay pipe to the outer edge of every member farm in the valley, arriving under its own pressure from the elevation of the bluff. Because Caleb had built the spring house at the highest point of the natural drainage, and James had done the geometry to carry that elevation advantage across the full length of the system. The son of the man who had tried to steal the spring became the engineer who multiplied its gift across the whole bowl of Grassy Cove. I do not know whether Harlan Crow lived to understand the full shape of that particular outcome. I hope he did not to give him pain, but because a man who lives long enough to see his own history rearranged into something he could not have predicted deserves at least the clarity of seeing what the rearrangement was. Dr. Samuel Briggs returned to the cove in 1892 with a younger colleague and a plan for the most comprehensive study he had undertaken in his career. A 5-year systematic comparison of yields and nutritional content across spring-watered and ordinarily watered fields in limestone country. He had grown gray in the intervening years. The restless brightness of his eyes settled into the deeper patience of a man who has accepted that proving slow truths to a world that prefers fast answers is a long commitment. He worked through 5 growing seasons, measuring and recording with the thoroughness of a man who understands that a result carries only the weight of the process that produced it. Yields, nutritional density of the fruit, mineral content of the soil at different distances from the spring outlet and at different seasons. The same values on comparable farms using well water and creek water and rainwater, building the comparative record that would make his conclusions resistant to the arguments of anyone who accepted the methods. When his account was published in 1897, it carried numbers that surprised even me, and I had been living with the evidence in front of my face for 15 years. Yields on spring-watered crops were elevated by 40% on most varieties, and more than doubled on others. The mineral density of the fruit was higher by 1/3 than fruit grown on the same seed stock with common water. The soil in the spring beds, thin and stony when I bought the lot in 1881, now tested as rich dark loam built up by 15 years of mineral deposition and the living community of soil creatures that abundant feeding sustains. In the acknowledgments, Briggs wrote that he was indebted to Wanda Birch Marsh, who had the courage to plant where her whole valley feared even to drink. He cited the first tomato, the seedling I had carried from the boarding house in a coat pocket and set into rocky ground on a late April morning in 1881, as the earliest documented evidence of everything his 5 years of careful measurement had gone on to prove. Ida Brandt, had she lived to read it, would have smiled the close-lipped smile she saved for the moments when something turned out to be exactly what it should be. There is a particular satisfaction in being confirmed by science that you have already confirmed by living. The science makes the truth legible to people who could not read the evidence you were standing in the middle of. I was grateful for Briggs's account, not because it told me anything I did not already know, but because it said it in the language that Harlan Crow and his lawyers could not argue with, in the language of peer review and permanent record, and a learned signature beneath a learned conclusion. Caleb died on a September afternoon in 1903. He was sitting on the porch he had built to face the limestone bluff in the chair, made from the same cedar he had used for the cabin walls, with a glass of blue spring water resting on the table at his elbow. The same water he had knelt to drink the day his hands finished the roof above us. He had drunk it every morning of the 19 years of our marriage, the water that had tinted his teeth faintly blue, in the way that long and daily acquaintance with a thing tends to leave its mark. He had been watching the bluff when I came out to bring him a second glass. The morning light on limestone is different from the morning light on any other surface. It holds the light, rather than reflecting it, the way stone holds warmth long after the air has released it. And Caleb had never stopped finding the bluff worth watching in all the years he had spent in its company. He went the way of the deeply contented without struggle with the sound of the spring running soft beneath the porch boards, as it had run beneath every conversation we had ever had, and every morning we had ever risen together to work the ground. The mountain had been holding in readiness for longer than either of us had been alive to receive it. I buried him near the foot of the bluff where the sound of the water never stops. Not in any season, not in any weather, not at any hour of any day or night. Pearl Evers helped me letter the stone. Pearl was 28 by then, and she had been coming to the Saturday classes since she was 12 years old. And she had grown into a woman with her mother's practical dignity and something additional of her own. A systematic understanding of the cooperative and the full network of what the water was doing across the valley that had already made her the most capable person in the cove for running what the spring had become. She had joined the managing committee at 22 and had been coordinating the day-to-day water distribution since James Crow finished his pipe system. The words on Caleb's stone were his own, spoken to me at the channel on an evening during the second drought. Summer, when we were filling jugs together in the fading light. He had set down the jug he was filling and looked at the blue water moving through the channel and said what he had been thinking in the quiet way he always said what he had been thinking. This water was always good. We were only afraid of the color. He had looked across the channel at me. You were not. We carved those words into limestone, quarried from the same bluff that had fed the spring for a century, and set the stone close enough to the water that its sound was present in the air around it in every season. I went on without him the way the spring goes on because there is no other way that I have ever found to be available. There is the work, and there is the ground, and there is the spring doing what it has always done, and the living things answering what the spring gives and the knowledge of how to be useful to both of those processes. When you have those things, you have enough to fill a day, and enough days make a life. And a life made of enough days becomes without your having specifically planned it. Something that does not simply end when you are no longer in it to continue it. Pearl took over the Saturday classes in the year after Caleb died. Not because I could not teach them, but because she had been absorbing them for 15 years and had things to add that I had not thought to include things she had learned in her own years of working the spring system. I sat in the back of my own class and found that I was learning, which is the appropriate condition for anyone who still has the capacity to recognize a better understanding when it is being offered. The cooperative grew to 41 member families by 1905. James Crow had extended the pipe system twice by then, adding branches as new families joined. And the blue water from my pool was flowing through more than 2 miles of buried pipe to ground I would never walk in my remaining years. The mountain's gift, which had been arriving at the surface of my 3 acres for 100 years, without anyone present to receive it, now fed a valley. I worked my garden every morning in those last years before the coffee was ready in the early light that belonged to the ground and the plants and the water before anything else claimed it. My hands were stiff in cold weather, with a stubbornness that required warming before they would close, but they knew the work they were doing the way long practice embeds emotion below the level of instruction, in the place where knowledge lives that does not need to be remembered, because it has become part of the body's own understanding. The tomatoes were still growing from Ida Brandt's seeds, saved and carried forward without interruption from the summer of 1850 to the spring of 1906. 56 years of saving the best seed each autumn from the best fruit of the best plant. The line carried forward through drought, years in hard winters and a winter in a boarding house when I owned no ground to put anything in, but kept the seed in my coat pocket and waited. Every fruit carried the same great ribbed purple-shouldered look, the same density of flavor that Amos Whitfield had named in the June light of 1882, and Pearl's buyers in Nashville and Knoxville named now in letters that still arrived at my door, carrying the same amazement, as though the tomato had somehow exceeded each person's prior understanding of what the word was supposed to mean. The cursed lot had become the most productive small holding in 3 counties. The assessor's books showed a value that the original assessment of $9 could not have predicted or contained. I found this amusing in the way that certain long journeys become amusing when you can see the whole shape of them from sufficient distance. Jasper Tull was still behind the same counter. He bought my tomatoes every Saturday without reference to the warning he had offered me at that counter 25 years before. We had no explicit conversation about it. He nodded at me across the porch, sometimes the nod of a man acknowledging that the world had turned out to be larger than his caution. And he bought his tomatoes and went home. Some apologies are spoken, The truest ones are the slow return of someone who comes back week after week to buy what he once swore was worthless. It was a morning in April of 1906, the spring having come in early and warm that year. The redbuds already gone, and the apple blossoms open along the foot of the bluff that Pearl came out to the original tomato bed and found me. I was beside the bed with my hands in the soil. It is possible that I was planting. The bed had been prepared the day before, and there were seeds in my coat pocket, as there had been seeds in my coat pocket since the winter of 1880, when I began the practice of keeping them close against the possibility that some morning I would want to put them in the ground, and I did not want to have to go back inside to get them. It is also possible that I was listening. The spring behind me had been talking in its low and ceaseless voice for 25 years. The voice of water moving through stone toward light, the oldest and most patient voice in the valley. And I had never stopped finding it worth attending to. Perhaps at the very end, more than at any other time. Because at the very end you understand things about patience that you were still learning when you were younger, and thought patience was something you could acquire quickly. Pearl said afterward that I looked as though I had bent down to put something in the ground. Her younger sister, who had come along that morning, said I looked instead as though I had bent down to hear something the ground was saying. I think they were both right. I think planting and listening were always the same act, and I had spent 25 years on this piece of ground in the slow process of learning that they were learning it, the way you learn true things by doing them long enough, that the learning becomes the life, and the life becomes the learning, and the distinction between the teacher and the student, and the ground, and the water, and the knowledge, and the person who carries it becomes less important than the fact that all of it continues, that the spring goes on, that the seed goes in, that the root receives what the stone has kept in the dark and gives it back as light. The spring is flowing yet, blue and cold and sweet and loaded with the dissolved bones of the mountain over more time than any life can hold in a single thought, carrying its freight of nourishment up out of the dark, the way it carried it before there was a county to fear it, or a woman to drink from it, or a community to receive what it offered. Through miles of buried pipe across a valley, it had been waiting to feed since before the first road was cut through the ridges above it. Pearl runs the cooperative now. The Saturday classes continue taught by Pearl and by the people Pearl has taught the knowledge moving forward, the way water moves finding its way to the places it is needed, along whatever course presents itself. The tomatoes are still grown from the seeds I carried in a coat pocket, from a boarding house room in a winter I would not choose to repeat, saved forward every autumn without interruption by hands that understood why the continuity mattered, even when the person who had carried the line the longest was no longer there to carry it forward herself. Caleb's stone holds its words at the foot of the bluff, for anyone who comes to read them. And people do come. They come to stand inside the spring house and look down through the glass at the blue light moving in the pool below, and they put their hands in the water and feel the cold of it, the real cold of something that has been deep in the earth and carries the earth's temperature rather than the seasons. They lift the water to their lips and drink, and what they taste is what I tasted in April of 1881, kneeling alone at the rim with my last $12 already spent and 40 years of a quiet woman's knowledge in my hands, with the whole frightened valley telling me the water was wrong. It was not wrong. It was never wrong. What was wrong was the fear that dressed itself as wisdom and stood at the rim telling everyone within hearing that the color was a warning, that the strange was a danger, that the water no one had tasted was poison of a kind that required no tasting to confirm. Fear is very good at wearing wisdom's coat. It has had a great deal of practice, and it almost never explains what it is actually afraid of. It took a woman at the end of her available options and the beginning of her real understanding to kneel down and find out whether the fear was right. She was not brave in the way of people who do not feel afraid. She was afraid in the precise way of someone who has lost everything and is being warned away from the last thing remaining. She was afraid, and she knelt down anyway because the alternative was to live inside someone else's fear for whatever years remained to her, and she had never once in her life been able to do that. What the stone keeps in the dark, the root receives as light. Your blue spring is out there. It has been flowing your whole life, patient, as limestone waiting for someone willing to kneel at its rim and find out whether the thing the world has been warning you away from is actually what they say it is, or whether it has simply been wearing a color that frightened the people who never got close enough to drink from it. Stop listening to the ones who never wet their lips. Kneel down and drink.